everybody, my name is Terry. Welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to do an engine overhaul of the Matchless G3L WD. This image shows you my cylinder head with the valves removed, and as you can see there's a heavy build-up of carbon, and the reason for the engine overhaul is to address the cause of this, not just the symptoms. Now, cleaning things up or decarbonising is pretty straightforward, and I've done another video for it. I'll put a link in the description so you can get to it. That also shows how to disassemble the bike to this point. But the manual says that every second time you decarbonise, you ought to go in and have a look at the piston. And that's what I'm doing here. And when I did that, oh my goodness, I found something that definitely needs fixing. When you look at the piston from the right-hand side of the bike, the piston crown above the rings there is nice and clean, and you can clearly see the circlip which is holding in the gudgeon pin which connects the piston to the con rod. But on the left-hand side of the bike, the rim near the piston crown is encrusted with carbon. And where's the circlip? It's completely missing. And there's worse news to come, because when I inspect the barrel, I see two neat grooves running down in parallel. And that's where the circlips come off and created gouges. And it's through those gouges that oil is coming up from the crankcase underneath, burning in the combustion chamber and causing all of the carbon buildup. Now clearly the cylinder needs to be rebored at least, and that's beyond my capabilities, so I entrust it to T&L Engineering of Bedford Limited, and they do a grand job. Now their assessment is that reboring the cylinder isn't possible because it's already oversized. So what they do is they fit a liner, essentially something like a baked bean can, inside the original cylinder. So after boring to make sure there's no imperfections and a new liner being fitted, a few weeks later I get the barrel back in its new state. If you look closely inside the newly lined cylinder, you'll see thousands of tiny scratches. These are deliberate, and they've been put in a process called honing, because as the new piston rings work up and down in the cylinder and mate themselves to the barrel, you need somewhere for the oil to go to create some lubrication. Now a relined or a rebored cylinder will always need a new piston and rings, so as I unwrap this and have a look at it, inside there is the gudgeon pin. When I try and push it out with my thumbs, it won't move, it's absolutely stuck fast. But this is perfectly normal, because the piston's made of aluminium, which is very sensitive to heat and will readily expand. And all it takes to get the pin out is a little bit of hot water, not even hot enough to burn your hand, and then it will push out easily. And in fact, if you have a gudgeon pin in a new piston which isn't solid like that, then I would be worried, because as the piston expands that would rattle and it could cause engine damage. To the piston rings next, and for this piston and on this bike there are 3 piston rings. The lower one is an oil control ring and is slightly thicker and a different design than the other two. The other two are identical, and there's no up or down or top or bottom to these. The two top rings can go on either way. That is not the case with every piston and ring combination, so if you're looking at this to work on a different kind of bike, please consult the manual carefully to make sure you get it right. Back to the bike now to start the assembly process. You'll notice I've put a rag around the con rod to avoid dropping things accidentally into the crankcase. In here, removing the compression plate. Now, this was added for British Army bikes to lower the compression ratio to make the engines last longer. This plate has a paper gasket above and below it, and the one underneath is pretty stubbornly on there, so I'm using a razor blade to remove it, because clearly we need to put new gaskets on. And here it is, all cleaned up. And over on the workbench, the compression plate gets the same treatment. Now it's time to go fishing, or magnet fishing to be exact, using one of those cheap tools that no one should be without, a magnet on a telescopic stick. So down we go into the crankcase, and after just a couple of seconds, to my shock and delight, I hear a little tink as something goes onto the end of the magnet. As I pull it out, you're seeing this just as I'm seeing it. Now that is a result. This little thing's been dancing around in my crankcase having a party for the last 5,000 miles. That doesn't mean I want it there any longer. Now I drained the oil using the bottom sump plug before I went magnet fishing in order to make sure it's just a little bit easier to get at anything that was in there. So now I'm putting the sump plug back in. Now when you remove the sump plug in a Matchless G3L WD, you don't get a huge amount of oil coming out because of course it's a dry sump system. Most of it sits up in the oil tank. But it is important to remember to put the oil back in so that you replace what's been removed before you start the bike, and we're all forgetful, so I put a little note on the accelerator to remind me. and now to the cylinder head, which has a bit of a long-standing problem. You can see this thread at the top here has broken away. So it's round to my friend Gary's house, who is a master craftsman, and he's promised to sort this out for me. One possible solution would be to weld some metal onto this and then to drill it and then tap a new thread. But Gary's come up with quite a clever way to fix this, which is much less invasive. So the first thing he does, using a very accurate milling machine, is clean up the hole a little bit. Then he goes in with a tap and cuts a new thread that goes in deeper. And what I do in the meanwhile is go and source a longer bolt than the original one, so that it will reach down into the new deeper thread. Now, the reason this is a good alternative to the welding technique is that the head is made of cast iron, and welding onto cast iron takes a lot of heat, and that can create some warpage, so we might create as many problems as we solve. So now with a bit of extra thread put on the bolt as well, we put the rocker cover box back on with a longer bolt, and there we are, it's all fixed, good as new. So back to my workshop now, and it's time to put the two paper gaskets on, one below and one above the compression plate. But they don't quite fit. They cover up the little oil hole in the 3 o'clock of the aperture. So that's me just using a little stationary tool, the sort of thing that you'd put a hole in a piece of paper with, just to create another little hole so that the oil feed isn't blocked. And then it's carefully on with the paper gasket, then on with the compression plate itself, and then the second paper gasket which goes on top of that, which has also got a little hole made in it. Now when we put the barrel back on, the two down tubes that come with it will go into these rubber glands, one of which you can see me picking off here. The glands are necessary if you've got a compression plate, because otherwise there'd be a gap. Also, those push rod tubes are a route for oil, and the glands are required to seal the oil so it doesn't go all over the outside of your bike. Now, I've lost a little bit of footage here, which is annoying, but what I should have filmed if I wasn't such an idiot was checking the ring gap. So check the ring gap in the maintenance manual, you can see that here, and what it means is it's the distance between the two ends of the ring when it's in the cylinder. And then we place the rings each in turn into the cylinder and then use the piston to push them gently down to about halfway down the barrel. Once that's done, we just use a feeler gauge to go into what's left of the gap to see what the gap is. What I did capture was me just using the piston to push the ring out, having already measured it, and in my case it came out at 0.008 or 0.008 of an inch, which is bang on. Now to fit the rings onto the piston, starting with the oil control ring which goes on the bottom, I've smeared a little bit of oil, gently pry the two ends apart and slowly down into its groove, and then just repeat the process for the two on the top. Now once we've got them all on, we do need to make sure that the gaps, because there will still be a gap in each piston ring, don't line up, and that we try and put them at 120 degrees to each other. And in this way we avoid two gaps lining up and giving somewhere for the compressed gas to escape, which of course would mean you would lose a bit of compression and a bit of power. Now to fit the piston, I'm handling it quite quickly and gingerly here, albeit speeded up footage anyway, and that's because I've heated the piston up so we can get the gudgeon pin in, because otherwise it would be a little bit stiff. And now I'm pushing it through with my fingers and taking great care to check that once it's in, that it's in equally on both sides, because the little groove for the circlips to go in must be equally present on both sides. Now the circlips that hold the gudgeon pin in have got a tang, but you mustn't use that when you're putting it in, because if you do, you could deflect it towards the gudgeon pin, and that would present a problem, because the gudgeon pin itself could create some pressure on that tang and actually force the circlip out. So you can see I push in the outside, the round part of the circlip, and then just use a small screwdriver or a pick to flick it in from the side, being very careful not to put any pressure on the tang. And here again on the right hand side of the bike, and I've zoomed right in so you can see exactly how I'm doing this. And the reason why I'm labouring this point is because it was a circlip coming off that created all of the damage in the first place, which has led to the engine rebuild. And there's many an old fella wandering the streets of London with no arse in his trousers because his circlips fell out. so we're not going to do that. And finally, I'm going to get a pair of needle nose pliers and just rotate that tang so that it sits in the 6 o'clock position. Now, I don't know whether this is an urban legend or not, but it doesn't take a moment to do. But some people say that if you leave the circlip with a gap in the 3 o'clock or the 9 o'clock position, then the up and down motion of the piston can cause it to spring inwards and it might possibly pop out. It seems a bit far-fetched to me, but it doesn't take a second to do, so why not? Let's just put it beyond doubt. Now we'll apply some oil with our fingers to the inside of the barrel in preparation for remounting it onto the bike. And now to put the barrel on, which takes a bit of care because there's plenty of scope here for snapping the rings as you do this if you're not careful. And it's easier if you're not doing it on your own, but I'm doing it on my own so that you can see that it's perfectly possible. First of all, you can see that I've wrapped a towel around the conrod. That's to save things going down into the crankcase, but also it supports the piston in a nice upright position a little bit, keep it still. And now the idea is that using fingers, I'm gently compressing the ring on the top and then moving the barrel down. Now the risk here is that as you manage to get over one of the rings, that the weight of the barrel slips down and you end up snapping the next one because you haven't compressed it yet. So name of the game is gently, gently, softly, softly, little bit by little bit, moving the rings in. The other thing I would say is don't do what I'm doing here, because I learned this the hard way. Don't do it with bare fingers. I did it with bare fingers because I got better feel, but those piston rings are mighty sharp and I got a good gash in my thumb for my pains. So definitely wear gloves doing this. But you can see the idea. Gently compress the rings down with the barrel. Now you can buy a piston ring compressor and you can put that on, and it does make it easier to get the barrel on, but then you're left with the difficult problem of trying to get the piston ring compressor off by completely dismantling it and pulling it away or opening it enough so that it goes over the top of the barrel. I think it's perfectly alright to do it with your fingers as long as you're careful. And here we are, moving the towel away and a little rag. Now we can lower everything back down onto its bolts and we have the barrel pretty much back on. Now on with the spring washers and the nuts, and then once that's done we'll tighten them using the standard engineering practice of doing opposite corners. Now there are no published torque settings for any of the nuts and bolts or any of the fastenings on this in the Army manual. So basically my guideline would be use the Army size spanners, which aren't very big, and you can do it fairly firmly, but you don't want to do anything with any more leverage than that or you might strip a thread. And once this is all back together, I can't resist just moving the kickstarter to see the piston go up and down and listen to the delicious noise it makes. Now it's time to put the head back together and get the valves in, but first I'm going to give it a good clean. And the main thing here is that if you're using anything abrasive, make sure that it is softer than the head. So I'll start with a brass brush, that's not going to leave any scratches. And then if you're going to use something that's harder than a head like a screwdriver, then just be ever so careful with it. Now I've put one of the valves in, that's the exhaust valve, and I put a little bit of rubber tubing over the end, and I'm using that to twiddle the valve up and down, and I've put some grinding paste on the lips of the valve where the seal would be, and that gently laps it into position. Now most grinding paste will come with a little tool with like a rubber sticker on it, and you put it on the valve face and move it, but that's not very satisfactory. I found that they hardly ever stick, so I found that a little bit of rubber tube on the end of the valve stem makes it much easier to do this. And you can see that it achieves quite good results, really smooth around the edge of the valve there. Now to put the valves back in, this is one of those jobs you need 3 hands for. If you haven't got 3 hands, then you definitely need a vise. So protecting the head with bits of soft wood, I'm putting the valve in and then getting the 2 springs and putting them over the valve stem. And this is in preparation for getting the tool on to compress everything and then put the valve keepers in the end. It's not absolutely necessary to use one of these contraptions, it just makes life a little bit easier and they're not that expensive. But I've shown a method for doing this with cable ties in the decarbonising video if you don't have a tool. Now with the spring compressed, I'm going in with the 2 little metal half-moon shaped collets which go over the end of the valve stem, and then when the spring tension is released, that little circular washer type thing over the end pushes up against the collets and everything holds into place. Now we call them collets, but the Americans call them valve keepers, which I think is a much better name. It's quite fiddly, so you need to put the collet or the valve keeper in there. Have a little pick handy so that you can move it around to get it in just the right place. And then when you're absolutely sure that it's going to grip the end of the valve stem, then and only then gently take the tension off and everything should hold together. Now I'll flip everything over and repeat the procedure for the inlet valve on the other side. Now before we put the head onto the barrel, we put the copper gasket on there, which I have annealed before I put it on there. That means I've heated it up till it's cherry red, then quenched it in water. Now we'll put the push tubes onto the head itself, and then lower the arrangement on top of the barrel with the push tubes going into the 2 rubber glands at the bottom. Now you would think that the gasket would get disturbed and moved out of the way, but don't worry, because the 4 bolts that go in to secure the head will hold it firmly in the right place. And we'll tighten the 4 retaining bolts in the normal way. And once that's done, there's another gasket to go on top, and it's important this one is carefully positioned, because if it's even slightly wrong, then it will cover up some oil feed holes. Before we put the rocker cover on, we're just going to drop both push rods down into the tubes, and then we'll move the kickstarter until we can see that both rods are as low as they will go. Once we've done that, then we'll pull them out again. We do this because it makes them easier to insert later once the rocker cover is on. Each valve stem has a little steel cap that needs to go over the end. If you forget this, then the whole arrangement will not work. Now we carefully put the rocker box into position, gently moving the oil feed line out of the way. We hook it on at the back and then rotate it clockwise to get it on. As you do this, it's very easy to knock off those steel caps which are on the end of the valve stems. So gently does it, and be careful to also not to damage or to displace the gasket because of the importance of the oil feed lines. Now we're going to put the push rods back in before we screw down the rocker box, and the easiest way to do that is to unscrew all of the adjusting stuff at the end of it so it's a little bit shorter, pop it in, and then screw the adjuster back in with your fingers. We've also made this easier, of course, by moving the kickstart earlier so that the tappets at the bottom have gone down, so we got the maximum amount of room. But notwithstanding that, you still have to tip the rocker box back in order to make the space to get the push rod in. And then it's a simple case of replacing all of the bolts, noting that that odd one out, the silver one there, is the longer one because we repaired the thread, and then reconnecting the oil feed. Now with the work that we've done, there's been no need to adjust the timing, but there is a need to adjust the tappets. In other words, the small things that move the push rods up and down against the rocker arms and decide when the valves open. So the way to do this is move the kickstarter until one of the push rods, in this case the one on the right, which is the exhaust one, is as low as it will go. And then we undo the lock nut, which is the middle one, and then screw the adjuster nut, which is the top one, until it meets the top of the rocker arm. And the idea is that this should be just long enough that there's no play between the rocker arm and the top of the push rod. It's a adjuster screw, but it should be free to be able to rotate left and right. Now, having adjusted the exhaust push rod so that it's snug when it's at its lowest level against the rocker arm, we now move the kickstart lever again. And this time what we're trying to do is get the exhaust push rod to rise up, and that will expose all three nuts so they're a little bit easier to get at and put a bit of tension in it, which will hold it still. And now we're going to do up the lock nut in order to make sure that that position we've set remains set. Now, the best technique I found for this is to use 3 spanners. A spanner on the bottom to hold the push rod straight, a spanner in the middle to actually tighten down the lock nut, and a spanner on the top so that the adjuster nut doesn't move as you're doing it. I think we get a better view of it here as I'm adjusting the inlet push rod, which is the one I do next. So I've snugged it up with the thing at its lowest level, then I've raised it up to create a bit of tension, a spanner on the bottom to hold the tube, a spanner on the top to hold the adjuster, and then the middle spanner to adjust the lock nut. And if you don't have a top and bottom spanner as you're tightening this lock nut, everything will move and it will go out of adjustment. And once we've adjusted the tappets as best we can, now we need to put the spark plug in, because we need to make sure that the gas can't escape, because now we're going to test the compression to make sure we've got it right. On the first time of testing, we don't have good compression. You can see that there's no resistance here and I'm able to put the Kickstarter through. Now, if that happens, it's no biggie. All it means is that one of the push rods must be too tight. So we go back in and readjust, because if it's slightly too tight up against the rocker, there'll be a little gap underneath the valve as it's slightly open, and that's letting the air escape. So we'll go in and correct that, and then we'll try again. And there we go. Hallelujah. Now we got compression. There's resistance, and that only disappears when I pull the valve lifter lever. So now it's safe to put the bike back together and try and fire her up. And this is all pretty basic stuff, so I'm going to play some royalty-free music, in other words, crappy music, and use speeded up footage so I don't send you to sleep. Well, that's a relief. I can tell you she's starting and she's running sweet as a nut, but we are not quite finished yet. Now's the time to make a note of the mileage on your speedometer and then come up with a plan for running the engine in, because we need to tighten down the bolts periodically, and every time we do that, because the gaskets will tighten, We need to adjust the tappets so that everything stays good and the compression remains high. Thanks ever so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Please leave some suggestions if I've got anything wrong and I will change the video. See you in the next one.